Reverend Increase Pettibone found her on the church steps at 9:30 on a Wednesday morning in October of 1890, sitting there in her good dress with her hands folded, waiting for him to open up, and when he asked her what she had come about, she told him. She said, "Reverend, I have come to ask you to stop it. I know what you are doing. I know Mrs. Slaughter has spoken to you, and I know the Ledbetter women have spoken to you, and I know that on Sunday you preached on Naomi and the barley field and looked at me twice, and I am not a stupid woman." She said, "I have buried a husband. I do not intend to bury another. I can't love again, sir. It is not that I will not. I have thought about this a great deal, and I am telling you the truth of it. It is that the part of me that did that is gone. It went into the ground with him, and there is nothing there now, and I would be selling a man a horse with no legs." And then Rena Ashcombe said, "So you may stop looking at me on Sundays, and you may tell those women I said so, and I would take it very kindly if you would let me alone." And Increase Pettibone, who was 64 years old and had been a circuit preacher in 3 states and had heard a great many people tell him a great many true things on those steps, said, "All right, I will leave you alone." And then he said, "But I am not going to tell them, because they will only ask me why, and then they will know they got to you." And Rena Ashcombe laughed, one short surprised sound, the first one out of her in 11 months, and then put her hand over her mouth as though she had done something indecent. Now, I want to be clear about something at the start, because I have told this story to people who got ahead of it and were disappointed later. Rena Ashcombe was not being coy on those steps, and she was not being dramatic. She meant every word, and what she said was, in the strictest sense, wrong, but it was not a lie, and it was not weakness, and the man who eventually married her never once told her she had been wrong about it. That matters, and we will come back to it at the end. Rena Ashcombe was 33 years old in the autumn of 1890, and she had been a widow for 11 months. She was small and thin, thinner than she had been the previous year, which everybody in Bellwether, Kansas, had noticed, and only 2 people had said anything about, with light brown hair she wore pulled back very plain, and hazel eyes, and a scattering of pale freckles. And she had a habit, since November, of standing with her arms crossed and one hand gripping her own opposite elbow, as though holding herself in place. She had married Tobias Ashcombe at 19, and had been married to him for 13 years, and had loved him the way you love somebody when you have never seriously considered any alternative. He had been a wheat farmer with a quarter section on the flat east of town and a talent for machinery, and in November of 1889 he had gone under a threshing rig at a neighbor's place and had lived 4 hours and had not been conscious for any of them. They had no children. 13 years and no children. And that is its own long, quiet grief that nobody in a town like Bellwether ever mentions out loud to a woman's face, and everybody mentions behind her back. And here is what Rena Ashcombe had that most widows in that country did not have, and it is the whole reason this story is not the story you are expecting. She had the farm, free and clear, and she could run it. Tobias Ashcombe had died without a mortgage on him, one of about 4 men in that township who could say it, and Rena had kept his books for 13 years and had driven the header and had done every job on that place except pitch bundles. And in the spring of 1890 she had put in 110 acres of wheat with 2 hired men, and had brought it off in July at 18 bushels to the acre, which was a better crop than half the men in Bellwether Township made that year. So she was not desperate. That is the thing to hold on to. Rena Ashcombe did not need a husband to keep a roof over her head, and everybody in that town knew it, and it made them far more determined about her rather than less, because a woman alone who is managing is a much greater affront to a certain kind of town than a woman alone who is failing. I want to stop and tell you about the first year, before the fence and before the fire, because if you do not have it then, what she says on the church steps sounds like a mood, and it was not a mood, it was a year of very specific things. Tobias Ashkamay went under the rig at the Ledbetter place on the 9th of November, 1889, at about 2 in the afternoon. And he died at 10 minutes past 6 in the evening in a neighbor's kitchen with his wife holding his hand, and Rena Ashcombe was 32 years old and had been married for 13 years, and she went home that night to a house with the supper still on the back of the stove where she had left it at 1 o'clock. She ate it. 3 days later, cold, standing up, out of the pot, because it was there and it was food and there was nobody to see. She said afterward that she did not remember doing it and only knew because the pot was in the sink. The township was very good to her for about 6 weeks. That is not sarcasm. They were. 14 wagons came out that first fortnight, and the Kingsolvers cut her corn. And there was food in that house she could not have eaten in 3 months. And then Christmas came and went, and the weather closed in, and by the middle of January 1890 the wagons had stopped, which is entirely natural, and is nobody's fault, and is nevertheless the thing that kills people. The casseroles stop at about the time the shock wears off, and the actual grief starts. She was alone in that house from January to March, with 160 acres to plan, and no living relations closer than Missouri. Her mother was dead. Her father was dead. She had a sister in Sedalia who wrote twice a year. What she did, and this is the whole of Rena Ashcombe in one decision, was to open her husband's account books on the 4th of January and go through them line by line and find out exactly where she stood. It took her 9 days, and at the end of it she knew that she had a quarter section clear, $411 in the bank at Bellwether, a good header, a bad windmill, 2 horses worth keeping, and 1 that was not, and that if she put in 110 acres of wheat and got anything like a normal crop, she would be all right, and that if she did not, she would have to sell. She put in the wheat. She hired 2 men in March with money she was not sure she could spare, and one of them was a decent young man named Cyrus Kingsolver, whose wife Delphine will matter later, and she brought that crop off in July at 18 bushels, and on the day the last load went into the elevator, Rena Ashcombe stood in the yard in the dark and cried for the first time since the funeral, out of sheer relief, and then went in and went to bed. And in that same spring and summer, 11 separate men in that township made it their business to look in on her. I am not going to pretend they were all wicked, because they were not. 2 of them were genuinely kind old neighbors, and one of them was a boy of 19 who did not know what he was doing. But 4 of them were single men who had heard the words unmortgaged quarter section, and one of them, a hog buyer named Marmaduke Frisk, came out 3 times and on the 3rd occasion sat on her porch step for 40 minutes explaining to her, kindly, that a woman could not go on like this, and that people were beginning to remark on it, and asked her to think about him. She was 8 months a widow, and the thing about being asked to think about a man 8 months after you have buried your husband is not the insult of it. It is that it teaches you exactly what you are worth on the open market and exactly how much of it is the land, and after the 3rd or 4th one, you cannot unlearn it. And it puts a permanent thin coating of suspicion over every kindness anybody ever does you again. That is what Rena Ashcombe brought to the church steps in October of 1890. Not a broken heart in the ordinary sense, a year of arithmetic. She had worked out, quite carefully, that she could keep the farm alone, that the town would never leave her alone, that the men who wanted her mostly wanted the ground, and that the one thing she had that nobody could get at was the fact that she did not want any of it, and she had decided to hold on to that with both hands, because it was the only thing she owned outright that the whole township could not have an opinion about. And then Reverend Increase Pettibone preached on Naomi and the barley field and looked at her twice, and she understood that even that was going to be taken away from her, by degrees, by kind people, with the best intentions in the world. So she got up early on a Wednesday and put on her good dress, and went and sat on those steps and said it out loud to the one man in Bellwether whose business it was, so that it would be on the record, and so that nobody could say afterward that they had not been told. That is not a woman being dramatic. That is a woman filing a document. Now the other one. Ephraim Doherty was 41, and he had come to Bellwether in March of 1890, 7 months before that conversation, on the church steps, and he had bought the old Tolliver place 2 miles east of the Ashcombe farm, which was 160 acres of ground that nobody had made pay in 9 years. He was a big man, tall and heavy through the chest, with reddish-brown hair going thin at the crown and a full beard he kept short, and small deep-set blue eyes in a broad face, and enormous forearms, and a bad left knee that made him plant that foot flat and swing the leg slightly when he walked, which he had had since 1878, and never explained to anybody in that county. He talked very little. Not sullenly, he was pleasant enough when addressed, and he took his hat off to women, and he paid cash at the mercantile. But he did not visit, and he did not go to church, and in 7 months in that township he had not told one single person where he came from, or whether he had ever been married, or what he had done before March. Bellwether, Kansas, found this intolerable, and by the summer there were 3 theories about Ephraim Doherty in general circulation, and the mildest of them was that he had left a wife somewhere. The truth, which he did not tell anybody in Bellwether for a year and a half, was this. Ephraim Doherty had been a farrier and a stockman at Council Grove, and he had married a woman named Sabine in 1874, and they had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, and in the September of 1888 the diphtheria had come through that town and taken all 4 of them inside of 11 days. All 4. He had buried his family in a single week, and he had sold the place at Council Grove in the spring. And he had spent a year going from one thing to another, and in March of 1890 he had come to Bellwether because it was 200 miles away, and because the Tolliver place was cheap, and because 160 acres of hard ground is a thing a man can put his back into for 11 hours a day and not think. So, now you know what both of them were, and neither of them knew one thing about the other, and I want you to notice that they had arrived at the same place from opposite directions. She had said out loud, on a church step, that she could not love again. He had never said anything to anybody at all. They met over a fence line in November of 1890, and the first 11 words either of them ever said to the other were about a bull calf. That is not romantic, and I am not going to make it romantic. Rena Ashcomb's fence on the east quarter was down in 2 places, and a bull calf of Doherty's had come through it and was standing in her wheat stubble. And she rode over, and he was already walking the line with a bundle of wire on his shoulder, and he said, "Ma'am, that is my fault, and I am fixing it." And she said, "It is half my fence, and I will hold the wire." And they fixed 11 rods of fence together in an hour and 40 minutes, and said perhaps 40 words the whole time. And at the end of it he said, "Obliged," and she said, "Likewise," and they went home. That was the whole of their acquaintance for 4 months. I want to spend a moment on that, because it is not nothing. In a country like that, a woman alone gets one of 2 things from the men around her. She gets pestered or she gets helped in a way that has a bill attached to it. The neighbor who comes and does a job and then sits on the porch afterward and lets it be known, gently, that he has done it. Rena Ashcombe had been getting both since the previous November, and had gotten extremely good at recognizing which was which inside of about 4 minutes. And Ephraim Doherty fixed his half of a fence, and said obliged, and left, and did not come back. And she noticed that she had noticed, and was annoyed with herself about it, and put it away. The winter went by, In February she saw him twice at the mercantile, and they nodded. In March he hauled a bogged wagon out of the creek crossing for the Ledbetter boy and would not take $1 for it. And the whole town talked about that for a week and decided it was suspicious. And on the 11th of April, 1891, a prairie fire came up out of the southwest with a 30-mile wind behind it and ran 11 miles in about 2 hours, and everything changed. If you have never seen one, I cannot make you feel it, but I will try. A grass fire in a dry spring in Kansas does not creep. It comes at the speed of the wind, in a line a mile wide, throwing burning tumbleweed a quarter mile ahead of itself, and the only thing that stops it is bare dirt or water or a backfire lit by somebody with steady hands at exactly the right moment. It came at the Ashcombe place at about 4 in the afternoon, and there was nobody there but Rena and one hired man, because the other one had gone to town. Ephraim Doherty came across 2 miles of pasture at a dead run on a plow horse with a barrel of water and a stone boat dragging behind him, which is a thing that should not have been possible, and he came into that yard and did not ask her one question. He said, "Barn or house?" And Rena Ashcombe said, "Barn, stock is in it." And that is what they saved. They lost the corn crib, and 11 rods of fence, and 40 acres of new pasture, and a stack of last year's straw, and they saved the barn, and the house, and every animal on the place, and they did it with wet sacks, and a plow, and a backfire that Ephraim Doherty lit at exactly the right moment, and at the end of it, the 2 of them and the hired man sat down in the burned-over stubble at about 8 o'clock at night, black to the elbows, and did not say anything for a long while. And then Rena Ashcombe said, "Your hands are burned." And Ephraim Doherty looked at them as though they belonged to somebody else, and said, "So they are." And she took him into her kitchen and put his hands in a basin, and that was the first time Ephraim Doherty had been inside another person's house since September of 1888. Now, the summer. They worked alongside each other from April to August of 1891, and it began because of the fire and continued because it made sense. His 160 and her 160 adjoined. He had a good header and no wheat worth speaking of that first year. She had 110 acres of wheat and a header her husband had rebuilt twice. He had a strong back and a bad knee. She had 13 years of books and a nose for weather that everybody in that township respected, and nobody would admit out loud that they respected. So they shared work. They cut her wheat first and then his, and they hauled together. And they were in the same field for 11 and 12 hours a day for the better part of 4 months. And I want to tell you what actually happened between those 2 people in that time, because it was not courtship, and neither of them was pretending it was. They were quiet together. That is the whole of it, and it is worth more than it sounds. 2 people who have each got a dead person in them, working alongside in a field, not talking, not being asked how they are keeping, not being told that it gets easier and that time heals, and that the Lord has a purpose in it. Rena Ashcombe had been told all 3 of those things approximately 400 times in 20 months. Ephraim Doherty had never been told any of them, because he had never told anybody anything. They talked about wheat. They talked about the header. In June, they had a serious disagreement about whether to cut a low corner that was still green, which lasted 3 days, and which she won and was right about. In July he came out one morning and she had a plate for him on the tailgate, and after that there was always a plate, and neither of them ever mentioned it. And in August, on the last day of the harvest, sitting on the tailgate of a wagon with the sun going down and 1,100 bushels in the bin, Ephraim Doherty said, without any preamble at all, "I had a wife and 3 children, and they died of the diphtheria in 11 days in September of '88. And Rena Ashcombe sat there with her tin cup in her hand. And she did not say, "I am so sorry." She did not say, "The Lord has a purpose." What she said, after about half a minute, was, "What were their names?" And Ephraim Doherty put his head down, and said their names, Sabine and Iris and Maud, and the boy, Tobias, which is a coincidence I have never known what to make of, and which I am obliged to report, because it is true. And then that enormous man sat on the tailgate of a wagon and cried in front of a woman he had known for 10 months, for the first time in 3 years, because somebody had finally asked him what they were called. The town had been watching all summer, of course. 2 farms adjoining, a widow and a widower, 4 months in the same field, a plate on a tailgate, Bellwether, Kansas. Did not require any more than that, and had in fact begun without it. By September of 1891 there were 2 parties in that town, and I want to describe both of them properly, because the villain of this story is not a person, and I do not want you looking for one. The first party was headed by Mrs. Ardith Slaughter, who was 58, and the wife of the man who owned the elevator, and who had decided in the winter of 1890 that Rena Ashcombe was going to marry again, and had been at it ever since. She was not cruel. She was worse than cruel, she was certain. She believed absolutely that a woman of 34 alone on a quarter section was a tragedy in progress, and that anybody who could prevent it and did not was guilty of neglect. And she had said to Rena's face on at least 3 occasions that it was not natural, and that she would come to see it. And the second party held that Ephraim Dougherty was a man with no past who had come out of nowhere and got himself alongside the only unmortgaged quarter section in the East Township inside of a year, and that a woman with a farm and no children and no living relations ought to be careful, and that it was a great pity there was nobody to look after her interests. Both of those parties were wrong. But the second one got hold of a real fact in the 3rd week of September, and a real fact in the wrong hands is worth 10 rumors. The fact was this: on the 14th of September, 1891, Ephraim Dougherty went into the Bellwether State Bank and asked Mr. Halliwell, the cashier, what a man would have to do to put a quarter section into 2 names. He asked it badly. He asked it as a general question, the way a man asks who has no idea how these things are done and is embarrassed about it. And Mr. Halliwell, who was not a bad man either, answered him and then went home and told his wife. And his wife told 2 people at a quilting on Thursday, and by the following Sunday it was all over Bellwether that the Dougherty man had been at the bank asking how to get his name onto the Ashcombe place. Rena Ashcombe heard it on the 27th of September from Ardith Slaughter, on the church steps, in the exact spot where she had told a preacher 11 months before that she could not love again. And I want you to understand what that did to her, because it was not jealousy, and it was not even really suspicion. It was terror, because Rena Ashcombe had spent the whole of that summer not calling the thing by its name, telling herself it was neighboring, telling herself it was shared machinery, telling herself that a plate on a tailgate was a plate on a tailgate, and now somebody had said it out loud in front of the mercantile, and the moment it was said out loud she had to look at it, and what she saw when she looked at it was not a fortune hunter. What she saw was that she had been happy in that field. All summer, happier than she had been in 2 years. And the part of her that had gone into the ground with Tobias Ashcombe in November of 1889, the part she had told a preacher, was gone, was not gone. It was standing right there in the road in front of the mercantile, with a market basket on its arm, alive and awake and absolutely terrified, because if it was not gone, then it could be taken again. And she had already learned exactly what that was like, and she had 4 hours of November 1889 in her that she was not able to live through twice. That is what people mean, usually, when they say they cannot love again. They do not mean the machinery is broken. They mean they know precisely what the bill is, and they cannot pay it a second time. So Rena Ashcombe went home and did not sleep, and on the 29th of September Ephraim Dougherty came over to talk about winter wheat and she met him in the yard and did not let him get down off the wagon. She said, "Were you at the bank about my land?" And Ephraim Doherty, who had been rehearsing something for 11 days and now had to say it standing in a yard with a woman looking at him like that, said, "Yes." She said, "Say the rest of it." And he said, "I went in to ask how a quarter section is put into 2 names, because I meant to ask you to marry me, and I meant to put mine into both of ours the same day. And I did not want to ask you until I knew how it was done, because I did not want to stand in front of you with a thing I had not worked out." He said, "I never asked one question about your place. Ask Halliwell. I asked about mine." And it was true. Every word of it was true, and Mr. Halliwell confirmed it 11 days later to 4 separate people, and it made no difference at all by then. Because of what Rena Ashcombe said next. She said, "Ephraim, don't." She said, "I told Reverend Pettibone on those steps a year ago that I can't love again, and everybody in this town thinks that was grief-talking, and that I would come round to it. And I am telling you now, plainly, that it was not, and that I have not." She said, "I know what you have lost. I know it is 4, and mine is 1, and I have never once thought that made mine bigger. But you have got up out of it, and you are able to go again, and I am not." And then she said the thing that took her 11 days to find, and that cost her everything. If you ask me, I will say yes. That is what frightens me. I will say yes, because I have been happy in that field this summer, and I am not made of stone. And then I will spend every day of the rest of my life waiting for the man to ride into the yard and tell me you are under something, and I did that once, and it took 4 hours, and I cannot do it again, and I would make you wretched. You would have a wife who could not breathe when you were late." And she said, "So don't ask me. Please, I am not saying no to you. I am saying I have not got it to give, and you deserve better than a woman who is only pretending she has." And Ephraim Doherty sat on that wagon seat for a while. And then he said, "All right." And he turned the team around and went home, and did not come back, and that was the end of it for 11 months. 11 months. He did not court her, and he did not press her, and he did not send letters, and I want to be very clear that this was not a strategy. Ephraim Doherty had been told plainly by a woman he loved that she had not got it to give, and he had believed her, because she was an honest woman and had never once lied to him about anything, and he did the thing he thought was decent, which was to leave her alone. They farmed 2 miles apart for 11 months. They saw each other at the mercantile. They nodded. In November he sent his hired man over with the header when hers broke a sickle, and did not come himself. In February she sent back a note of thanks in her own hand, 4 lines long, and he kept it in his coat until it fell apart. And Bellwether, Kansas, decided that they had had a falling out over the bank business, and Ardith Slaughter told several people that she had always said there was something about that man, and the whole town settled comfortably into being right. Now what happened in those 11 months is the actual middle of this story, and it did not happen in a field. It happened inside one person, alone, in a house, over a winter, and I am going to give it to you as honestly as I can. Rena Ashcombe got worse before she got better. That first winter after she sent him away was the hardest she ever had, harder than the one after Tobias died, and the reason is simple and cruel. After her husband died, she had been numb, and numbness is a kind of shelter. In the winter of 1891, she was not numb anymore. She had been woken up in a wheat field in July, and there was no going back to sleep. And so she spent 5 months feeling absolutely everything. The grief for her husband, which came back on her that January, worse than it had been in a year, and the wanting, and the shame about the wanting, and the loneliness of a house where there had never been children and now would not be. She stopped eating properly. Her hired man's wife, a young woman named Delphine Kingsolver, took to coming over on Tuesdays with a pie and staying 2 hours, and Rena Ashcombe never once said what was wrong, and Delphine Kingsolver never once asked, and that woman probably saved her that winter, and neither of them ever put it that way. And in March of 1892, Rena Ashcombe did the thing that changed it. And it is not what you would expect. She went and dug out her husband's letters. Tobias Ashcombe had written to her in 1875 and 1876, when he was breaking sod on that quarter, and she was still at her father's place 40 miles off, and there were 14 letters, and she had not opened the box since the funeral. She sat on the floor of that bedroom in March and read all 14, and they were not what she remembered. She had been carrying a saint around in her chest for 2.5 years. The letters were from a 22-year-old who could not spell, who was frightened about money, who was funny in a coarse way, who had been impatient with her once and apologized badly in the next letter, and who had written in the 9th one, and this is the sentence that did it: "Ren, if anything happens to me out here, you are not to sit down in it. You go on and be happy. I mean that, and I will be angry if you do not." She had read that letter in 1876 when she was 19 years old, and it had meant nothing to her at all. She sat on that floor for a long time, and what Rena Ashcombe understood, at 34 years old, on a bedroom floor in March, was that she had not been protecting herself from another 4 hours in November. She had been keeping faith. Somewhere in the middle of that grief she had come to believe that being unable to love again was the last service she could do him, that it proved the thing had been real, and that if she went on and was happy, it would somehow unmake 13 years. And her husband at 22, breaking sod, with no idea he would be dead at 36, had written to tell her in advance that this was nonsense. She did not go to Ephraim Doherty. I want to be careful here, because this is where the story would be easy, and it was not easy. She did not ride over in March and tell him she had changed her mind. She was not ready, and she knew it. And she had told that man she had not got it to give, and she was not going to go back to him with a half-thawed thing and let him build a life on it. What she did instead was live through a spring and a summer. She put in wheat. She started eating. She took Delphine Kingsolver's pie on Tuesdays and began, by about May, to talk while she ate it. She went back to church in June, and when Ardith Slaughter said something arch about the Doherty man, Rena Ashcombe said, in front of 4 women, "Mrs. Slaughter, that man fixed his half of my fence and saved my barn, and never once asked me for a thing, and I will not hear it." And Ardith Slaughter did not know what to do with that, and never did work out an answer to it. Now I owe you his side of those 11 months, because I have given you hers, and it would be a poor account that left him standing in a field 2 miles east waiting to be sent for. Ephraim Doherty went home from that yard on the 29th of September, 1891, put his team away, went into his house, and sat down at the table in the dark for a considerable while. And what he decided that night, and he held to it for 11 months without one wobble that anybody ever saw, was that she had told him the truth, and that the truth was not about him. That is a very hard thing for a man to hold on to, and most cannot. The ordinary response to being refused is to decide that the woman is mistaken and needs helping to see it, and there was every excuse for him to think so. He knew she had been happy that summer. He had seen her face at the fire and on the tailgate in August, and he had a whole winter with nothing to do but think about it. Half the men in Kansas would have been over there by December with a speech. He did not go, because of Sabine. That is the piece I have been saving. In 1873, a year before he married her, Sabine Doherty had been engaged to somebody else, a man in Council Grove who had died of a fever that autumn, and when Ephraim Doherty came courting her in 1874, she had told him no twice, and had told him plainly that she had nothing left and would only make him unhappy. And the second time she told him, he had said all right, and had left her alone entirely for 7 months, and in the spring she had come to him. He had married a woman who had said the exact same sentence to him 16 years earlier. He knew, from the inside, what it costs and what it is worth and how long it takes, and he knew above all that the one thing that would have ruined it in 1874 was if he had gone back before she was ready and made her feel that saying no was a thing she would have to keep doing. So he waited 11 months, 2 miles away, and did his own work. And it was a bad 11 months for him too, and worse in one particular way, because he had a thing she did not. He had gotten used to it. A man who has buried 4 people in 11 days and gone on living for 3 years afterward has built himself a way of getting through a day, and the way is generally to work until the light goes and to not stop. And the summer of 1891 had wrecked that method, because it had shown him that he could still be pleased about something. A plate on a tailgate, a woman winning an argument about a green corner, and once you have been pleased about something, you cannot go back to the machine. His hired men, 2 brothers named Vasil and Petro Havriliuk, who had come out from the old country in '89 and worked for him for 9 years altogether, said afterward that the winter of 981 into 982 was the only time in 9 years they saw the patron sit down in the middle of the day. He did 2 things in those 11 months that matter. The first was in November, when her header broke a sickle at the worst possible moment, and he sent his own over with Vasil Havriliuk and stayed home. He wanted to take it himself so badly that he saddled a horse and got as far as the gate. And then he thought, if I carry it over, she has to be grateful to me. And she has just told me she cannot pay, and I will be putting a bill on her doorstep dressed up as a favor. And he took the saddle off and sent the hired man. I have always thought that was the single most decent thing anybody does in this story. And the second was in February. Rena Ashcombe sent back 4 lines of thanks in her own hand, and Ephraim Docherty read them about 200 times. And then he went and did a thing that had nothing to do with her at all. He wrote to the pastor at Council Grove and asked for the graves to be tended and enclosed money for it, which he had not done in 3 years. And he asked for the plot to be marked properly with all 4 names, which he had not been able to face in 1889. The stone went up in May of 1892. He never saw it. He sent money for it, and never once went back to that town for the rest of his life. And when Rena Docherty found the receipt among his papers in 1921, she sat down with it for a long time and then had it framed. And it hung in the same room as the letter. 2 people, 2 miles apart, both of them spending a winter, doing the same work in the dark, and neither of them knowing it about the other. That is generally how it goes, in my experience. People imagine that the year apart in a story like this is empty, and that the real story stops until they get back together. It is the opposite. That 11 months is the entire story. Everything after the accident in the northeast corner is just 2 people finally saying out loud what a winter had already made true. And on the 19th of August, 1892, at about 11 in the morning, a boy came riding into the Ashcombe yard from the east at a flat gallop, and Rena Ashcombe was in the garden, and she saw him coming a quarter mile off. She said afterward that she knew what it was before he opened his mouth. She had seen a man ride into a yard like that once before in her life. The boy said Mr. Docherty's binder had turned over on the side hill in the northeast corner, and he was under it. Here is what I have always thought is the finest thing about Rena Ashcombe. And it happened in the next 4 seconds. And nobody saw it but her. She was 34 years old, and she had told a preacher on a church step that she could not do this. And she had been telling herself for 2.5 years that the reason she would not marry again was that she could not survive the moment she was standing in, and now she was standing in it, without having married anybody, without having been paid anything for it at all. That is the joke that grief plays on people, and it is not funny. She had refused the marriage and got the terror anyway. And Rena Ashcombe dropped a basket of beans in the dirt and ran for the barn and had a horse out and was on the road east inside of 3 minutes. And what she said to herself the whole 2 miles, over and over, was, "You are going anyway. You are going anyway." So what exactly was it you were protecting? He was not dead. I will not draw that out, because there is a kind of story that would, and I do not care for it. The binder had gone over on a side hill, and the tongue had swung and put him down, and the frame had come across his chest and pinned him, and it had taken his 2 hired men and a neighbor 20 minutes to jack it up and get him out. And by the time Rena Ashcombe got there, they had him laid on a wagon sheet in the stubble, and he was awake and swearing, which, as I have said before, is the most beautiful sound in the world under those circumstances. 4 ribs, a cracked collarbone, a great deal of blood from a scalp cut that looked far worse than it was, which is the way of scalp cuts. And she got down off that horse and walked across the stubble and knelt down beside him, and Ephraim Doherty looked up at her out of a face half covered in blood and said, "Ren, I am all right." And Rena Ashcombe said, "I know. I could tell from the road you are making too much noise to be dying." And then she put her forehead down on his shoulder and stayed there for about a minute in front of 2 hired men and a neighbor and the doctor's boy, and nobody in that field said one word, and Ephraim Doherty got his good arm up and put his hand on the back of her head. She nursed him at his own place for 5 weeks, with Delphine Kingsolver's sister staying in the house for propriety's sake. And the town talked about that too, and by then not one person in that story cared. And on the 29th of September, 1892, 1 year to the day after she had sent him away out of that yard, Rena Ashcombe sat down beside a man with 4 cracked ribs and said the thing she had come to say. She said, "I told you a year ago that I couldn't love again, and I want to say now that I was not lying to you and I was not being brave, and I have not changed my mind about it." Exactly, she said. "What I have worked out is that I got the words wrong. I could not love again the way I loved him. That is true, and it will always be true, and I do not want to. That was 13 years, and I was 19 when it started, and there is no doing that over, and any man who wanted me to would be asking for a thing that does not exist." She said, "But that is not what you asked me for, and I have had a year to notice it. You never once asked me to feel about you the way I felt about him. That was me. I set that price myself, and then I told you I could not pay it." And she said, "So, I have a new answer, and it is a smaller one, and I hope it is enough. I cannot promise you I will not be frightened. I stood in a field on the 19th of August with my heart coming out of my chest, and I will do that every time you are late for the rest of your life, and I am not able to help it. What I can promise is that I would rather be frightened in your kitchen than safe in mine, and I have been safe in mine for 3 years, and it very nearly finished me." And Ephraim Doherty said, "Ren, will you marry me?" And she said, "Yes, and I want your name on my quarter and mine on yours, both on the same day, and I want it done before the wedding so that this town has to find something else to talk about." They were married on the 12th of November, 1892, by Reverend Increase Pettibone, who was 66 by then, and who said afterward to his wife that in 40 years of preaching it was the only wedding he had ever performed where he had personally been told 2 years in advance by the bride that it was never going to happen. He had never mentioned that conversation to one living soul. He never did. They had 29 years. They farmed those 2 quarters as one place and made it pay. And in 1900 they bought the Ledbetter half section and made that pay too. They had no children of their own. In 1896 they took in a boy of 11 named Casimir Nowak, whose parents had both died of typhoid in a sod house 8 miles west, and they raised him, and he took their name at 15 because he asked to. And he farmed that ground until 1951 and his sons after him. Ardith Slaughter died in 1904, and Rena Doherty sat up 2 nights with her at the end, because Ardith Slaughter had nobody, and because Rena Doherty had decided a long time before that being right about somebody is not the same as being finished with them. Ephraim Doherty died in 1921. Rena Doherty lived until 1936, and on the wall of the front room of that house, until it was sold out of the family in 1958, there hung a small framed thing that visitors always assumed was a marriage certificate, and never was. It was a single page of a letter written in 1876 by a 22-year-old man breaking sod on a Kansas quarter section who could not spell, and who had been dead since 1889, and it was the 9th letter, and it was framed to show one line. "Ren, if anything happens to me out here, you are not to sit down in it. You go on and be happy. I mean that, and I will be angry if you do not." Her second husband hung it there himself, in 1893, in the first spring of their marriage, and he dusted it for 28 years, and he never once in his life felt one moment's jealousy about it, because he had buried 4 people of his own, and he understood exactly what it was. It was not a first husband on the wall of a second husband's house, it was the permission slip.